This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, and now you can rate the podcast on Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. I had mentioned that I was really interested in going on other podcasts to talk about secular grace and secular humanism, and I've been doing that. Former guest on the show, Jack Robertson, and his good friend Kenyatta have a podcast called Kenyatta and Jack Save the World. I was able to go on their podcast. I fit right in. It's kind of a Gen Xer perspective on the world. And we were able to talk about secular grace and how to find meaning as an atheist. I was also invited on a podcast called Cucumber Talks with three guys, Bryce, David, and Marshall, ranging from agnostic to faithful believer, but also having gone through one level of deconstruction or another in that process. And that was a really great conversation. They asked really insightful questions, and I got to talk about secular grace, hopefully to an audience that might otherwise not hear it. We acknowledged that it might be hard for someone who's going through deconstruction to even know what the term deconversion or deconstruction is, and let alone listen to a podcast with the word atheist in it. I continue to be very interested in going on other podcasts. I'm in talks with Luke Jensen of Recovering Evangelicals to try to see if we can do a guest exchange there. If you have a podcast and you're interested in having a secular humanist perspective and a discussion about secular grace with an honesty contest thrown in, I'm definitely available. Please reach out to me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. My guest today is Judah. Judah grew up in a Church of God tradition that he says was Pentecostal adjacent. His father was very much a leader in this, and he says that at times became very cult-like. What's really interesting about Judah is that he also came from a very conservative background that included an anti-vax and anti-government perspective. Judah began to question at a relatively young age, and ultimately as a teenager acknowledged to his family that he no longer believed. Worse than that, though, Judah also was interested in going into the medical field and delving deeper into science, and in many ways that was as hurtful to his family. Judah has been very helpful to me to ask constructive but critical questions about secular grace, and we get into that a little bit here. You can also hear more of that in my Ask Me Anything episode. The point that Judah makes is that secular grace should not be a blanket forgiveness for abuse, atrocity, and I completely agree with him, and we get into why that is the case. Today, Judah is a medical student. He has a scientific epistemology, and we talk about how that has helped him on the other side of deconversion. You can find some of Judah's writings at jmedic.medium.com. There will be links in the show notes. Here is Judah to tell his story. Judah, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Glad to be here.
Judah, thank you for reaching out to me. It sounds like you have a really interesting story to tell. You've also been a part of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, and so that's pretty cool. But we'll begin as we always do. What was your faith tradition growing up?
Yeah, so my faith tradition is, I don't think unique for America per se. I was, Church of God Pentecostal adjacent growing up. So my father came to the faith and explored a variety of different denominations. We'll get into more details of his life and kind of what led to that. But he settled on the Church of God Pentecostal adjacent, mostly because he felt that, and I quote, God is alive in these people.
Okay, yeah.
The charismatic movement was extremely important to him and my mother. So I think those beliefs were core to what we did. It got far more, the only way I can describe it is cult-like. Later in the faith tradition, it became more separatist. They separated out of that denomination, tried to start their own house churches with specific doctrine, specific beliefs, and there's a few, key ties to players in the house church movement. But yeah, it was definitely charismatic.
Yeah, I can kind of relate. If you know my story at all, I came to Christianity as a teenager, and my mom and I were literally church shopping, like with no experience whatsoever. It was like, where do we want to start going to church? And we were very much attracted to more Pentecostal, more charismatic. So that whole idea of it's alive, or the people there are alive, I can kind of relate to that actually. So.
Yeah, yeah.
And then how about for yourself? Was that at a young age, was that real for you? Was it something that you engaged in yourself?
Oh, absolutely. So my first remembrance of Christianity, of my contact religion with religion in my youngest memories, I was probably 3 or 4 at the time, and I remember coming down the stairs to my dad's old room, and he had a prayer room set up. And in this prayer room, were his set of books on, you know, it was for anything from Frank Peretti to,
Yeah.
Benny Hinn and the key players in the charismatic movement. And it was in that room that my father had this old picture of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he would pray in tongues so loud that it would keep me up. And I wondered what it was. And I would talk to him about it. And I remember even at 3 or 4, just thinking, okay, this is kind of odd, but also like, wow, that's a whole new language. Like, what is this? And
Yeah.
I remember asking him questions about the Trinity and how this all worked and whatnot. So for me, God really was a real and alive, and that tradition reinforced all of those beliefs. Like I remember speaking in tongues at the age of 8,
Uh-huh.
getting involved in end times theology at the age of 8 or 9, and I was pretty much sucked in from there.
And then how about like when you hit the age of reason? Were there any questions at that point in time, or were you really engaged in like youth group, things like that? Or
Yeah, so it's kind of shadowed with this um, flirting with the more separatist movements around 9 to 10 that I think colored my age of reason in a certain way. So around the age of 9, my parents decided to homeschool me. So we came down and moved across the country, and we arrived where I'm currently at. And they, were church shopping. They found a church, and they were like, oh, well, let's just homeschool. It's in the middle of the school year. And so that kind of separation out away from a society at large, I think resulted in less questioning. So when I went through the age of reason, it was very much in the vein of all of these people are wrong. I'm,
right.
searching through these science books, and this is an absolute load of crap. Like these people are writing biased articles about radiocarbon dating. The world's all, got to be 6,000 years old because I'm reading Answers in Genesis and it's telling me this.
Yeah.
There were a few moments there though where there's kind of like peers, there's lights in from the outside world came in, and I remember watching a PBS episode with Huckle's embryos,
Okay.
and I don't know if a lot of the listeners are familiar with it. I think most people who've gone through deconversion, if you've had to grapple with younger creationism, you'll realize that they concentrate on Huckle's embryos a lot. And one of their so when Haeckel was coming up with this hypothesis, he's talking about, when you look in the embryonic form, mammals are going to share like a common morphology at a certain week, right? And then
Right.
he's tracing their morphology throughout. This is what a horse embryo looks like. This is what a human embryo looks like. This is this. And he generates this hypothesis that, well, if they're similar in the embryonic forms, then you know through both micro and macro evolutionary trends, you've got this adaptation that occurs throughout time, but you almost get to look back in time in the embryonic form. And I remember that appealing to me because one, it seems kind of intuitive, right? Like it strikes reason, and it's like, okay, I can get behind that. That seems like something a reasonable person would say. And I remember grappling with the idea that all of the debunking that I heard from AIG Answers in Genesis at the time was, oh, well, Haeckel, was borderline fraudulent. He didn't tell you that if you really, explore multiple areas of, you know, the animal kingdom, all those embryos don't really look so similar, and they had a lot of, very detailed arguments. And so, I've always been intellectual. Since the time I was young, I was asking questions. And
Yeah.
I'm sitting there at 12, and I remember heading to my room and thinking, man, am I going to become like a theistic evolutionist? Like where do I go with my theology? And I think this represents, I've often thought it, but looking back, it represents the sheer amount of buy-in that you have to have in order to continue believing those things as an
Yeah.
intellectual person, and even as a child who obviously had those beliefs ingrained in me. I knew that if that pillar is knocked out, it's going to be really hard to recover from.
Right. I think you've touched on something that doesn't get discussed very often, but from the apologetic point of view, they have arranged things such that it's kind of if and only if A and B and C and D, like, and any one of those things isn't 100% true, the whole thing crashes down. And so it sounds like for you, that is creationism, or young earth creationism is beginning to show some cracks at that point in time.
Right. I think that was kind of the first crack for me, was around 12. Another big crack for me was, I had gone through puberty, and I started to get, attraction to both men and women. And I
Uh-huh.
was developing these crushes on, guy friends. And of course, that's, seen as sin. And,
Yeah.
I'm beginning to repress that. And so to me, it never made sense that, well, I mean, I guess it made sense that that was a sin, and it made sense that I'm a sinner, and that's the reason why I'm getting these attractions, and that's the reason why I need to repress this. But what wasn't clear to me was why God wasn't relieving me from that so easily. Like, I
Mm.
had to try really hard to repress that. And my young mind went to, if God really is all powerful, and I'm praying to him and wanting these things to go away, then why aren't they going
Mm.
away? And why, and how can I be a better Christian? So then you get into that loop of, now you're in self condemnation. But if you look outwardly in the church, they're like, God is not a condemner. He's loving and forgiving. He's inviting. He is grace. He is this. And so you get this almost like bipolar view of God, where inside you're repressing things and believing you're this awful sinner. And outside of it, you're supposed to lean into him as love and grace. And so, the more sophisticated theologians will say, you just need to find this nuanced view of God. You just need to explore more. But to me, it just began to start not making sense. I would say around 13 or 14, though, I just succeeded at both cementing in my young earth creationism
Hmm.
and cementing in my belief that I had fully like repressed and gotten away from same sex attraction, which was a big like personal struggle of mine at that time.
Okay.
Um, and so with those two things kind of secure, I think I took a deeper dive into my branch, which was, big into end times theology, from there.
So kind of a doubling down. You were able to kind of absorb those questions and double down on them.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've mentioned end times a few times. So that sounds like that was a major part of your theology at the time as well. What was that specifically, and how did that apply to you?
Yeah, so it was a transition from, more of a pre-tribulational rapture. So I mean, it was always post-millennial, right?
Mhm.
Or not post-millennial, I guess it would be pre-millennial. Like, the millennial period has not come yet. There will be a literal second coming. None of this is figurative, other than a few select passages and revelations. But they always, even though if they're figurative, they always have a corollary in what's going to actually happen in the real world. So it was very left behind esque for a while, until my father, who, my household's very structured in a patriarchal kind of context,
Okay.
decided the family was going to transition our belief to the more post trib, because he was convinced that no, we're going to have to go through the tribulation. And
Okay.
so in comes this hard, early kind of beckoning to the Trump era where it's Obama's fault and he's going to create martial law and that's going to bring in the tribulation period. My dad looked at my brother and I and said, you guys aren't going to live past the age of 16. You guys got to get ready. We went out
Wow.
and bought guns, survival food. I mean, and this is a man with a doctorate now. I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
this is my family is rather educated, man. My mom has a bachelor's degree in social work. My dad has a doctorate. The stereotype that people have about people with fringe beliefs, I think, often harms the ability to actually identify who obtains them and has them.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so in this case, you have normal people by day out in the public, but behind the scenes, we were believing in this literal second coming and everything's oriented there. Keep in mind, I'm still homeschooled, so I'm still sectioned off from a huge swath of society. I didn't even really have a lot of friends in the homeschool movement. I was so radical.
Okay.
Um, so it's very much a cling to family, cling to beliefs, and cling to this idea that we will be saved from this awful place they call Earth.
Yeah, I want to make just a couple of points about that. Like the number one, I think the most dangerous thing you can think is I'm not susceptible to being fooled or being absorbed into cult like behavior.
Yeah.
Because, we are human beings. There's something wired in us to be social, to be a part of the group, to belong. And I tend to think that the social bonding or the belonging comes first and the beliefs come second. And, so you can find yourself with a group of people who are loving and kind and wonderful. And then slowly but surely they're revealing, what if you had that all up front, you would say is unreasonable beliefs. But again, if as a child, you're born into that. You never even had the opportunity to look at it from outside. And so you're in this insular bubble. And of course you're going to take on the things that the adults in your life are telling you are true.
Yeah, yeah. And there's even, I think a bigger calling to anyone who has been born into that kind of world. You begin to see it, as you pointed out, like these contradictions in people, right? Like they appear loving and kind and generous to other people, but behind they've got these fringe extremist beliefs that
Mm-hmm.
they simultaneously are so sure of, but at the same time, they don't want to talk about because they almost know intrinsically that they'll be branded a conspiracy theorist, a cult leader, whatever you want to insert the thing here, because people ask me and they're like, "Oh, were you raised in a cult?" Friends of mine. I'm like, "No, I don't consider it a cult. I consider it cult-like. I consider it cult adjacent. If there would have been enough following to get behind
Mm-hmm.
the beliefs of my father at that time, I'm convinced that it would have become a cult.
Yeah.
Um, but it thankfully never got to that level. There were multiple times it kind of ramped up. We'd get a house church started and there'd be 9, 10, 11 people coming. But every time I could kind of see looking back, they saw the extremism and they were like, man, we can't deal.
I think the word cult can scare people off. And really what we're talking about is more or less control or the use of power. People have asked me all the time, do you think evangelicalism is a cult? And my general answer is no. Can it become that? Yes, absolutely. But you have these environments where a leader gains more and more power, gains more and more control. And when that leader is no longer able to be questioned on any level, I think you then cross that border into cult like behavior.
Yes, yes. I am 100% in agreement with you, and it's important to take that more academic perspective to social movements. Like you have social movements that might be radical, but they're not controlling,
Mm-hmm.
and I think evangelicalism on the whole is very much like that. They try to control through more sinister methods. I think that's kind of what makes it in a way more dangerous than a cult because with a cult you can at least identify the control mechanisms. It might be dangerous to be in the cult, but those outside know how to identify it because
Mm.
cults are pretty good at identifying themselves to people who are fairly rational, right? Not to people who are born in it, not to people who
Right.
have friends and acquaintances in there, but generally to people who are just like, man, these people are bonkers. I don't understand why they have these beliefs. But when you have these movements that are cult like, or they're on this spectrum where they have some form of manipulation, but it's not overt, say sex, physical boundaries, things like that, that's when the abuse, in a lot of ways, the emotional and spiritual abuse that people go through is on a new level. You can't
Yeah.
really capture it because the unfortunate thing is it isn't objective and it's going to be dependent on the person. There are some people who can exist in environments like mine and they probably come out going, yeah, that was kind of nuts, but I still have a 90% of those beliefs. I'm just not going to be as extreme. Whereas you have me, I was out of there at some point.
I definitely want to get to that. I just want to make one last point here. We've danced around this a little bit as well, just to point out that those kinds of control groups can happen outside of a religious context as well. The political movements, even the prepperism, right, can become cult-like when it is not associated with religious ideology, although it may be quite often
Yeah.
in practice.
That happens frequently, I think, in our modern landscape because it's easier to polarize people and get them to join these movements, right? I think it's dangerous to just throw out cult willy nilly. I got in a hilarious Facebook debate with an old acquaintance of mine that thought that my current more liberal beliefs are cult like, and I'm like, well, you can question them, and I'm not
Yeah,
controlling anybody and telling them that they can. So explain to me how this is cult like.
exactly. Exactly. Okay, I feel like I've pulled you off of your storyline here. So in your teenage years, you're beginning to recognize a few things. You've doubled down a bit, but you're also starting to recognize the isolation a bit.
Yeah, I think this is where we kind of need to weave another thread in here because it
Okay.
makes the story uniquely mine, but also I think it draws on another thing that you see in these homeschool, like, very kind of Duggar-esque environments where they get very separated off from the world. And it adds a new layer to deconversion and to what you have to go through. In my specific case, I had, told you when I originally reached out, but I think the kind of anti-vaccination, anti-medical establishment, anti-government sentiments were there.
Okay.
And you see that in a lot of these movements, and it's not something that gets talked about a lot. But those kind of conspiratorial beliefs get fed into it so that it now becomes, you know, we're going to keep our children from getting vaccines because one of them might be the mark of the beast,
Okay.
or we're going to keep our children from getting vaccines because we've seen the autism rates go up. And I heard this one article that said, yada, yada, yada. I'm part of this Facebook group.
Right.
And so I'm getting fed these messages about religion, but I'm also getting fed these messages about my government and medical doctors. And I'm not seeing medical doctors for problems a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think that adds to kind of the separatism that you see in these movements, where it's not only are they wrong about religion, they're wrong about healthcare, and
Mm.
we know that it's better. My father, he's a fantastic clinician in a lot of ways. He's a chiropractor, but that profession is very much married to pseudoscience and very much married to anti-vaccination um, supporters, even
Right.
if they're not upfront about it. There's actually a bit of a modern schism between chiropractors now, where they're like, half of them are like, yeah, we're going to maintain this old tie to vitalism and these kind of supernatural beliefs about vital force. We align the bones, and now the vital force flows through you.
Right.
And these more modern chiropractors are like, dude, we're just glorified physical therapists. We want to stay in line with the evidence. You guys are bonkers. Like,
Yeah.
you go your way. And so I'm kind of getting fed this message of, we are the pure ones. We are the people who know the healthcare. We
Ah,
know what's wrong with society. We know that it's going to end. We know these things. And so the epistemic flow there is very sure. And I think that fed into my doubling down in the teenage years, because I'm seeing my dad, when he had fantastic clinical outcomes. He's going in the office, and some of these patients who probably had crappy medical doctors or just had really complicated problems. And due to either natural history or whatever he was doing, we were seeing great outcomes. And so I am sucked into this belief in my father as a man, but also in the both religious and cultural context that I'm in.
Very interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on the topic, but I do think it's interesting that not necessarily chiropractic, but the homeopathy wing of things. Often it's just that a practitioner is going to spend time with a person. They don't have 75 patients to get through in a single day, and and so you can actually wind up having positive outcomes by accident. And I think we're going to talk about medical science here in a little bit, but I just think that is interesting that it's sometimes hard to make these distinctions between effective or ineffective things as important as medical and healthcare.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you touched on a big thing there. I want to highlight, you said it might happen by accident, but I also want to point out that it might happen on purpose. So, for example, in modern medicine, a lot of times we don't, and I think I mentioned it earlier, but just for listeners, I'm admitted to medical school currently. That's going to be what I want to do. I want to become a physician investigator and do a lot of both clinical medicine but also clinical research, and so these topics are close to my heart and what I think about day in and day out. But a lot of the reasons we get those good outcomes are when you take time with people is not the accident per se, although that's a significant component, but it's also that you are able to see through the complexities of that patient, and you might see something that somebody else didn't see simply because that patient now had more time to talk about their history, to talk about what's going on with them.
Mm.
And you're able to piece together the puzzle without anchoring on a diagnosis or anchoring on that one visit and thinking, oh, just because this person has this history, they for sure have this condition
Right.
or this is what the diagnosis is. And so you're able to think more clearly because your human connection with that patient can even grow, and now they are more willing to share information with you versus if you keep it very supply line.
Right.
People aren't, and so it's not that the medicine is endangering them, it's not that the treatment is endangering them, it's that the either right diagnosis hasn't been arrived at or that person hasn't felt heard. And then I'm sure, as many people know, if you've looked into a lot of skepticism um, type articles, they'll tell you, we know now that the placebo effect is enhanced if that person feels like the other person is listening to them.
Yeah.
If they feel wanted and they feel like they are finally getting to the point where their problem might be over, you can enhance that effect tremendously.
Yeah. Wow. That's a whole other topic, the placebo effect. But again, sorry, Judah, let's get back to your story.
Yeah.
So again, take us through the next steps.
Yeah, so we're coming up on this end times event, right? And I laugh at it now, but it was around 2012-ish era. So, I'm still politically on the right because, my family grew up that way. I'm a young earth creationist, and I forget what had happened specifically. I started looking into radiocarbon dating and I was like on the fence. I heard these arguments from these old earth guys, and I'm like, man, like the scientific side of me like really wants to say like the earth is old. Like some of these
Yeah.
arguments just don't make sense. And my family gets into these wild conspiracies about how, martial law is being imposed by Obama. There's these concentration camps. You can see them on YouTube, this and that and the other. And I'm like, maybe? Question mark.
Yeah.
This is beginning to sound extreme, even for me.
Yeah.
And I was born into this.
Right.
And, I think a lot of it too was I was feeling a lack of connection to my family because the minute I would try to tear down bits of theology that I felt were superfluous, like, for example, I think the bits about original sin never made sense to me. I didn't get how I was liable for the sins of others.
Yeah.
As if I'm not being judged as an individual. And it very much conflicted with my American political ideology on the right. I was like, no, I'm an individual. I have rights.
Yeah.
But I guess in my religion, I don't. Um,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem like okay. So you've grounded me in natural rights. Like your claim is the founding fathers were all these like borderline evangelical folks that were very much like we have natural rights as individuals granted by the creator, and yet now I have to pay for the sins of others.
Right.
And anytime I would challenge that, I just am getting these pat answers, these bits of, well, no, that's not how that works. You're misunderstanding it. All that original sin means is that we're all born with a propensity to sin. You're still only liable for your sins, and it wasn't making sense. And so I began to feel separated from my family. I began to feel
Okay.
alone. I don't really have a lot of friends to lean on with these kind of struggles or anything. And again, I'm isolated in a lot of ways, and so I'm like, these end times beliefs don't really look right. And I remember looking up, end of the world 2012 or
Hmm.
something, and I'm finding all these like blogs, right? And I'm like, all right, I know how to read, I know how to use Google. Let's see if any of this seems legit. And so I'm listening to these YouTube videos about how 2012 is the end of the world, and this is near the date, and all of the end times beliefs. So I'm like, all right, who in the evangelical world is opposed to this belief system or
Interesting
like
question.
has arguments against it. And so I'm like, okay, because those people, like, I feel, have very sincere beliefs. So why do, for example, I had friends who were Lutheran and so they were amillennial. They didn't believe the millennial period was even a
Right.
thing. Like
Right.
end times wasn't a thing to them. And I listen to their amillennial arguments, and I'm just sitting there like, wow, these actually make a lot of sense. This book seems extremely figurative, talking about Revelation.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, I think to many rational people it seems very figurative, but when you encounter that argument, I again knew that, and this is right around 15, 16. I knew that if I let that pillar fall,
Hmm.
the whole thing is going to go.
Yeah.
And so yet again, we can call this tripling down. I mean, I
Okay.
just
Yeah.
dive right back into it.
I think that's very common, Jude. I think we all went through, multiple times of just like, oh, I'm just going to work harder at this.
Yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, I'm going through this, 15, 16. Like, oh wow, I'm never gonna get married. I'm never gonna get to have sex. I'm never gonna get to experience life. Like, why would God even choose to allow me to be born into this?
Yeah.
Why, now? And I'm beginning to find these resources within evangelicalism to like dive farther into theology. But every time I try to dive farther into theology, my family is like, no, don't use your brain to approach God. Use your
Mm.
heart.
And-
Let the Holy Spirit interpret the passages.
right.
Don't think, because when you think, the devil can manipulate your mind. He can cause you to doubt. And if you doubt, your faith's going to be crumbled.
You know, I've said this before, but I always find that it might be the hardest on bright kids. So kids who are a little more intellectual bent, a little brighter, a little more precocious, but grow up in a more fundamentalist environment because your natural ability, the thing that you're told God gave you, your ability to think, is then twisted somehow to say, well, you can't trust that. And so
Right.
you're really turning it back on yourself to I can't trust myself. And that is just such a dangerous feedback loop, a really painful one.
Yeah, yeah, and it happens, all too frequently in that movement is that you find these, and I've met them, and obviously feel like a tremendous sense of community for them or with them. You find people that went through what I went through and came out on the other side and don't believe that they're intellectual anymore, don't believe that they have academic potential, don't trust
Mhm.
themselves in relationships and jobs and all that. And it's not to say that I haven't dealt with intense imposter syndrome and all this, but I've been reasonably successful since exiting. And I think there are a few reasons for that. I mean, we might get into it when we talk about the details there, but I just feel for them because they were taught from a young age that their core identity, because if you're very intellectual, that becomes something you rely on because it's a strength,
Right.
is sinful. And at the same time, if they deconvert, that's the very thing that's going to lead them out. And so if that thing leads them out, you're almost left with this doubt of, well, were they right? Because they told me that when I doubted,
Mm,
my faith would crumble,
right.
and my faith crumbled. If A, then B. Well, A happened, B happened. Now, obviously, there's a flaw in their logic because they think that if A, then B, even though there's multiple inputs into B,
Yeah.
um, but you're left with this burning sense of, did I miss the boat? Did I deconvert for the wrong reasons? Am I really what they said? Am I just a doubting Thomas? Am I just that person who's now the angry atheist? It gets into all that.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's a very vicious cycle.
And so I think from there, when I kind of commit again to the faith, and again, this faith being very mixed with end times theology, I buy my own weapons. 16 is legal for me to own, and
Mm.
now I'm into this survivalist movement, and my dad had bought a shelter, and we're trying to predict like when it's going to happen and form these escape plans, and it just gets into all this craziness. I'm getting near the time when I was fairly successful with homeschooling because I was really disciplined,
Hmm.
and just like loved learning and loved reading and loved doing the work. And I got to the end of, I think it was probably sophomore year around high school, if I would have actually been in public school. And I'm just 110% committed to these end times beliefs. I mean, there's all that was on my mind. And then the date comes and the date goes. And we're out of the month of what we had predicted to happen.
Right.
And my entire world comes crashing down.
Mm. Wow.
Just, I remember you wake up and you're just like, all of that time, my entire life. Because keep in mind, before going to post trib rapture, we were still pre trib rapture. So we still thought that the end times were going to come. I was being told since I was 6 that the world would likely end before I hit, probably 30 was the estimate.
Yeah.
But then it was moved up. And so now the end times theology is you will not actually live a real life.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing my homeschooling thing, just doing the bare minimum to pass, not thinking
Yeah.
I need to get into college. I need to have
Yeah.
a job. I need to do any of this stuff. I need to learn how to date. None of that is on my mind.
Yeah. You're the kind of the point of growing up or your young adulthood is taken away because you think that there's no point in learning all those skills.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think there's a couple things that could happen at that point in time. People could either say, yes, I am able to rationalize this. Like it's just not the right day. We were just off. Let's recalculate.
Right.
Or they could start to say, this one crack in the dam means that the whole structure might not be correct. And I've often thought about it. What is it about that one thing that caused me to, this is where I go full tilt and start deconstructing everything. What was it about just that date not coming to fruition and me being there? I think it had to do with development. Like as you said, the whole point of growing up is you're trying to learn who you are and get developed and
Hmm.
you know have a good life, right? Like everyone wants to be happy to a degree, but I wasn't even preparing for anything after that. And I think where that comes in is I had already been through all of these doubts of my faith theologically, that this is now crap. I should really check those theological gaps to see,
Right.
is this one crack in end times theology really a crack in the whole matrix?
Yeah. What else might be wrong?
Right, right. And that just set me into probably a good 3 years of just researching young earth creationism, all these theological doubts that I had, the doctrines of original sin. I was a big fan of C.S. Lewis, so finding out that he wasn't so orthodox blew my entire world to shreds.
Sorry. Side note. Side note. I've had so many people tell me to read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, which I then read as an atheist, and I thought, this is kind of like Christian fan fiction. It's not even biblical, right? I mean, it's an entertaining story, but like I was amazed at how little, you know, Christian context there was in it. It was just a story, that was loosely based on this concept of a heaven and a hell. And anyway, that's a side.
Yeah, yeah. As I'm kind of getting into all of this stuff with the end time theology, and then that had led me into I'm beginning to debunk conspiracies left and right. I mean,
Okay.
my father becomes this like person that I'm now looking at as like, all right, you're telling me all these things are true. Like, if they're true, they will last through skepticism. And I think this is what
Absolutely.
leads everybody to a more firm, like more science-based worldview eventually if you get here is good beliefs withstand criticism of all kinds. Beliefs that are bad or harmful in and of themselves should be avoided, and beliefs that are kind of in between, you can kind of choose what you keep and what you don't based on your values. But
Yeah.
really, at the end of the day, I think that most rational people choose the beliefs that withstand criticism when you actually have to like go out and choose your beliefs consciously.
And I like to say in this context as well that true things don't deconstruct.
Yeah,
You know, if it's possible to deconstruct the thing, it's at least in that middle ground at the very best, right?
right,
Yeah.
right. And obviously this gets into a lot of like philosophical problems with just generating knowledge. For example, like among social beings, is that you're going to have a problem where knowledge in and of itself is a social construct to a lot of in a lot of angles. There's some objectivity to it, but with religion, almost none of it is objective or verifiable.
Hmm.
And so even the bits that someone might try to claim are objective, like the history, there's even holes in that. And so you're left with this thing that'll deconstruct because, like you said, it really isn't true. And I think what makes it particularly interesting to deconstruct it as someone who's young is you never are really taught how to deconstruct things in traditional education. But I was taught that in as a homeschooled kid because you're
No.
told we're special because we teach you how to think, not what to think. Most homeschoolers I've talked to, there's this vein that, like you said before, apologetics sets itself up where we're teaching you how to reason correctly,
Right.
but when you find a hole in their reasoning, you're now like, oh, I've beat you with your own tool.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
you had like the right idea,
Yeah.
but I'm going to make this better. And I explained it to my dad as I was deconverting. I'll have to rewind because the way I came out to my family was rather dramatic. But I remember telling my dad, like probably a year or two after I deconverted, I was like, I didn't leave Christianity because I wanted to go backwards. I left Christianity because I wanted to go
Mm.
forwards. I
Yeah.
found what I knew was wrong, and I said, this is wrong in my current ethical framework
Right.
because no good God would allow you to believe that His word had predicted a date and then not show up when He was supposed to show up, not have things happen like they were supposed to happen, and then just leave you guessing and praying and begging and having to, you know, almost go to seminary just to learn what is end times theology, right? Like it can't be this complicated.
Yeah. It becomes hidden secret knowledge. And, that is kind of antithetical to the idea of a God who wishes to make himself known. And so I think a common theme that has come up in your story so far, Judah, is just recognizing the internal inconsistencies, contradictory concepts within within Christianity or religion itself.
Yeah. And it's been something I've been kind of struggling with is that you're gonna have internal inconsistencies, I think, in a lot of belief frameworks because that's just how beliefs work.
And human beings, yes.
Yeah, and human beings, you
Yeah.
look at our politics, right? Like we have internal inconsistencies everywhere.
Yes.
But when those internal inconsistencies are at least acknowledged and they're not waved over per se, but in a lot of like secular internal inconsistencies, they're not as severe. They're not waved over with their hands. They're acknowledged by the academics or the creators of that framework. And people are allowed to question them freely and allowed to disagree with them without repercussions.
Mhm.
In religion, you don't see that because even if it's not cult like, there's still the repercussion of when you leave the faith, you give up almost everything. You give up your family, you give up your sense of peace, you give up a lot of stuff that really made your life whole,
Yeah.
and you're gonna lose that. Whereas in a lot of secular frameworks, they're like, oh, you don't want to be a secular humanist. Oh, you don't want to be a this kind of a academic, and you want to go do this weird kind of thing that's fringe. Okay, have a good life,
Yeah.
I guess.
One of the ironies that I find on this side of deconversion is that I am much more, or I'm aware of, cognizant of my own personal responsibility in a way that we talked about as Christians, that people should be personally responsible. But now I actually feel the full weight of that. The choices that I make, the ethical decisions or unethical decisions that I make have consequences. And I'm aware of that on a deeper level. There is no safety net. And I think that's, again, an irony because Christians, I think, see themselves as taking on personal responsibility. In a way, they are deferring that to God. God will take care of this.
It kind of fits into again, we'll get back to like how the story progresses, but where I'm at now, my family frequently in arguments or whatever comes up around holidays, Thanksgiving,
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, they'll say, oh, well, we really think that, you are overreacting about how we treated you and this, that, and the other. And, you know, it was a rough time for us. We really only believed these things about the end times because, we weren't in communion with God
Mm.
because we didn't follow the faith purely. Because now they're more in a relaxed, quasi moderate form of Christianity. They're almost
Okay.
back to like Church of God, Pentecostal light, but without starting house churches and being
Okay.
fringe. And it's because of that move towards the center that they're rewriting history essentially to say, no, this never took place.
Mm.
It was really our problem with God. And so again, they're deferring the responsibility, not in this way, not towards God, but internally towards their sin nature and saying it was my sin nature that wasn't in communion with God.
Yeah.
And that's why we believed that the world was going to end around this date. And then, they've even apologized for hurting me with that end times theology.
Okay.
It's weird to look at that in kind of the rear view mirror.
Right. Right. And I take it the way you're describing this, that's not enough, that you need a little bit more from them to acknowledge the mistakes that were made.
Yeah, I think anybody who's gone through a deconversion, not just of the religion, but of like the end times theology with the prepper type structure, and I've rarely encountered somebody that has. There's a difference between forgiveness and saying you're sorry, or there's a difference between an apology and taking full responsibility.
Right.
And the reason I got into this was because what resonated with me is something you said is that now our responsibility is for every ethical decision we make or lack thereof. And so we feel the full weight of like when I wrong somebody now within a more secular humanist sort of ethic, that's what I consider myself now.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I have to step forward and make restitution.
Mm.
Like if I hurt someone, it's not okay for me to say I'm sorry for, hitting you with my car for let's pick a funny example. I should pay your medical bills or my insurance should pay your medical bills. Like you need some sort of restitution for the damage that I caused.
Yeah.
But within Christianity, forgiveness is seen as the highest form of virtue in a lot of ways. I mean, Christ dies on the cross to forgive the world of their sins.
Right.
And what never ceases to amaze me now is like for so long, I held forgiveness to such a like that was the highest standard. Like
Right.
man, if you reach full forgiveness, like you're somehow going to, have reached this pinnacle of feeling at peace. I've forgiven my family for example, the end time stuff, but I definitely don't feel like I've gotten restitution for it. I don't feel like I've been paid back in full.
If you wrong somebody, paying them for the damages that you caused, right? Of responsibility to your fellow man in a lot of ways. And that's lost in certain political movements. It's also lost in evangelical Christianity, which I think has tied itself to that movement for a variety of reasons. I mean, you see evangelical Christianity specifically tying itself in with more right-leaning movements which emphasize personal responsibility. And I think it's an irony is they don't really embody that to the fullest in the fullest way they can, because they will say, oh, well, God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son so that we could be forgiven.
Yeah.
But again, why did that forgiveness matter for the rapist, for the murderer, for the people that have, committed mass genocide? Are you telling me that those people could be forgiven? And you say that to most Christians who are, in some interesting theological positions. They're more liberal Christians, or they're, I've met some, Catholics that think this way, and they think, no, that person's unlikely to be forgiven because their sins have been so great. But if you meet a pure evangelical Christian in America, somebody who's extremely fundamentalist in their beliefs, they're forced to say nothing else than that person will be forgiven. Because again, that internal inconsistency of personal responsibility, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but also as long as you get forgiven and you change your life and your character changes and your works are like semi okay going forward, you're Gucci, you're good to go.
Yeah. So definitely, I think the topic of grace obviously is significant for me personally. I want to acknowledge immediately that there's absolutely a dark side to the Christian conception of grace, and you've identified it quite clearly here.
Yeah.
And, I feel like as I talk about secular grace, I'm often adding, well, there's this caveat, there's that caveat. And just to make clear that I think in the cases of abuse, especially, like that's just an obvious one, we are not obligated in any way to forgive our abusers in any way. And mostly when I'm talking about secular grace, it's about human connection, about giving the benefit of the doubt, about being accepting of one another, and less about forgiving atrocities. If that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons I reach out to you, is because in defining any sort of concept or ethic, it's good to see like your fringe cases. And I think in mine, like giving secular grace to my family is definitely not what I want to do. Like I forgive them for little pieces of it. Like, for example, the end times theology, I even forgive them for that, because to me, they were people wrapped up in an extremist movement. They didn't really know. Do I want them to give me restitution for it? And that would feel good. And I definitely want that. Absolutely.
Right.
But for my own peace and sanity, forgiveness is there, but I'm not going to give them grace. Like they don't just get a card where it's now like, oh, like I want a human connection with you. I want this really deep relationship. My relationship with my family in a lot of ways has been fractured, and I think it will be permanently, because I don't think you can go through that and feel like these people are safe. Like you can open up to them, like you can really be yourself around them without any sort of ulterior motive. Because anytime I've brought these conversation topics up after deconversion, the proselytization back into the fold, all of that stuff comes up. And I just want to say to the listeners out there who are going through that with their families, like, you're going to feel crazy. You're going to feel like you want to go back. You're going to feel like, maybe you did this all wrong. You're going to feel like you're that stereotypical angry atheist. And in many ways you might be for the first few years that you come out. And it's okay to be that stereotype. It's okay to feel like you and Christopher Hitchens are walking side by side into the night.
Yes. Yeah.
But at some point, you kind of want to stop, unless that's your MO and you want to become the next Christopher Hitchens, go for it. But you're going to have to move on from that and eventually start to have a full value system, because reading Christopher Hitchens isn't a value system. There's more to it.
Right. Okay, so just a couple more topics. I don't think we directly addressed the way that you used the term epistemology earlier, but a kind of scientific epistemology. How has that benefited you? Do you think it has benefited you as far as the way that you live today?
Yeah, I think it's benefited me in multiple ways. When I first exited, I think this ties in with like my actual deconversion story, like the moment I come out, right? Mm-hmm. So the moment I come out, I'm dealing with a couple problems, because I'm always that person that deals with, like internal inconsistencies and these problems, because I'm very scientific by just like naturally that way. I always gravitated towards science, even in the Young Earth movement, mm-hmm. Because there were still scientists who were in that movement. Right. So, I read their work and I saw their thinking was, we have an hypothesis, we go out and we gather data about it and we generalize it to this theory. Sure, when it conflicted with, theology, they were a little bit different, and I kind of mm-hmm. caught on to that. But up until that point, you could follow that epistemology and get into it. And so when I became more of a liberal Christian, probably 19 or 20 before I fully deconverted, and I was a theistic evolutionist and whatnot, I'm beginning mm-hmm. to be more scientific in my epistemology. The final time where I said I am an agnostic atheist is I had noticed that the more liberal I became in my Christianity, the more passages I had to think they were figurative, and they didn't actually make any contribution to my epistemology of religion at all. Mm. It almost had to become all wishy-washy faith, all just, I guess we don't understand how evolution and creation could go together and how this story is just allegory here. But yet my pals over in the evangelical corner are using this to, dumb down education and do all these terrible things in the name of religion, right?
Yeah.
I think it benefited me because I started to be able to even dissect the liberal version of Christianity and go, this doesn't make sense. It's not as dangerous as the other forms, but it still isn't sufficient to live life fully, because every time that somebody challenges my views, I'm just going to have to say, I guess it's faith. I guess we don't understand. I guess this is all just a mystery. And I've met some liberal Christians that are wonderful human beings, wonderful academics. They get a tremendous benefit from their faith. I don't know how they do it. That's not for me. I tried it. I was actually reading a book. I don't know if you read it, Finding God Between the Waves.
I haven't read it yet, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
So I'd actually read that book as I was like fully deconverting. Yeah. And I read another book called A Doctor in Search of a Miracle. This is where it gets back to the medical epistemology and how these two things kind of come together. And the main area where this has benefited me is my dad was always into faith healing, and he was always, into homeopathy and chiropractic and all these things, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's, if you read the book, it's a really old book, hard to get a hold of. This thing's written back in, it's at least pre-2000. It was written by a gentleman who was essentially a consultant to the AMA because they were dealing with reports of American physicians who were going or starting to get into this kind of bonkers stuff happening in, Asian countries, psychic surgery. I don't know if you've read anything about that.
My favorite scene in the Andy Kaufman movie is when he discovers at the end, he's at a psychic surgeon and he sees the trick and he has this just great expression on his face. It's one of my favorite scenes in movies.
Yeah. And you get that picture, in this book. I'm forgetting the author off the top of my head, but you get the picture in the book that, this guy he's religious in a lot of ways, right? He actually talks about his Catholicism a little bit in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the weird thing is he starts to go away from psychosurgery, and in his own studies, he starts to study faith healers, and he zeroes in on Catherine Coleman, who was big in the charismatic movement. My family knew her. She was like a distant cousin on my mom's side, extremely, devout lady, and she would have these big faith healing services and proclaim that people were healed, and they'd be walking out of wheelchairs, and just some crazy things would happen. Cancers were disappearing, and you get these mass movements. And he studied all these patients at one of the areas, and this was before, ethics boards and all the 9 yards. Right. So he's just writing about his investigative journalism into this.
Yeah.
He follows this guy that had, trying to remember the specific case study. The guy had MS, and he was in a wheelchair due to it.
Wow.
Okay. If you know anything about MS, it's cyclical. So it has flare-ups. Has a lot of like these reversions to the mean, right? Regression to the mean. So you'll get really bad symptoms one week, 1 month, might be in a wheelchair, and then the next week you'll be out. And then the next week you'll be back in. And then eventually it might get to where your baseline is wheelchair, you have all these neurological problems. Well, this gentleman had these issues. He was proclaimed healed at one of these services. He's walking around and he's like, I haven't walked in years or whatnot. And you follow him and you find out that he's back in a wheelchair in 2 weeks. And not just that, he dies from a complication of MS like 2 months later.
Right. Wow.
And so I'm sitting there like, all right, this is the last thing to go, because I'm a liberal Christian, but I still am kind of tied to this idea that faith healing might happen occasionally.
Right.
And so I'm now like this last problem that I'm having to solve with a more scientific epistemology, because it's beginning to become like, the way I want to think and live my life. It's why I had slowly backed away from evangelicalism, and I secretly had these more liberal theological beliefs. I'm like, what conditions would qualify as a miracle? How would I know that a miracle had occurred? Because before, when I was more evangelical, miracles always occurred, right?
Right.
It seemed obvious.
Yes. Yeah.
But now I felt this weight of responsibility. Like I'm the enlightened, more liberal Christian. Like I should know, when miracles are occurring, like when God's acting.
Yeah.
And I kind of came to the conclusion, like, I don't think I can. I don't think I can really say when a miracle happened unless the skies opened, the Red Sea parted, and I was just stuck in front of, a blinding light like Paul. I don't know how I would really verify that. And by this time, I've deconstructed all of my family's conspiracies. I'm no longer into end times theology. And then I was like, what if I just let go of it all? What risk is there? And, a little voice in my head is like, well, your eternal salvation. I'd been working as an EMT at the time, because after this end time stuff happened, I went to EMT school, fell in love with pre-hospital medicine, and I'm doing this. And I remember, seeing my first few patients die. And I remember thinking, you know what? If I deconstruct this all and I fully leave the faith, I'm willing to accept the fact that I'm risking hellfire, but I care about the truth too much to live a lie for the rest of my life and to not be honest with myself and others as to what I truly believe at the time. And that's when I came home. I remember setting the book on my dad's nightstand and going, I'm done. I'm sorry. But Catherine Coleman, our second cousin, I'm like, she's a fraud. This book proves it. I, have deconstructed this all. If you'd like me to write anything to you about it or talk about it, like, I'm more than willing to, but I'm done.
Yeah. Wow. What was his reaction?
Whew. Anger. You can't just leave like that. Like, why didn't you come and talk to me about your doubts? Kind of just a bunch of victim blaming. I prayed over you when you were a young kid. How could you, just leave this faith? And we got into these numerous discussions about the doctrine of hell, doctrine of original sin, the end times theology, because he's still very much in this. He was resetting dates at the time. Okay. It was, that date didn't work out. These other dates will work out.
Yeah.
And I I just kept coming home. And, the rest of my family, my mom, brother, they're not wanting any part of these conversations. But my dad is trying to bring me back into the fold, and just nothing was hacking it, right?
Yeah.
And you could just see this sense of frustration growing in the family of just like, wow, like he actually is an agnostic atheist now.
Yeah.
And a lot of this came to the forefront too, because I had already been kind of outspoken with my politics. I didn't really tolerate homophobia or any sort of racist comments, which my family would occasionally, not only in a microaggressive way, but just like overtly racist comments. Like
Yeah.
80% of slaves had a great time in slavery, that kind of thing.
Yes. See, now having personal ethics is difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was already kind of used to expressing myself, but that just sent them over the edge. It was very very ostracizing. And then they had already been toying with it, like I was going to move out in the next year or so, but they decided like it was kind of time to give me like a move out date and say, if you want to go ahead and go off to college and finish your education. I told them I wanted to be a medical physician at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Which, again, antithetical to my family. My dad's a chiropractor. Allopathic physicians are the devil because he's a vitalist. So I'm sitting there like, Dad, not only do I want to leave the religion, but I want to join the people who you think are poisoning everybody with vaccines and pharmaceutical medications.
Yeah, ouch. Yeah. I feel like we've come full circle in one sense, that what I said earlier about the belonging comes first and the beliefs come after. In many ways, I think what hurts the people we love who remain believers is that in some way we are saying they can't help but feel like we're rejecting them. And so I do get it. Like I'm empathetic of the feelings they have. But as we've said, you have to make that break. You have to move forward. You have to be willing to do what's right for yourself.
Yeah. And I think what makes it difficult, obviously, I recommend to anybody who comes out of something like this, get therapy, but especially in my case, because there were actual elements of emotional abuse in with it. I think that the key is giving yourself grace looking back. Like looking back, I think I was way too angry. I think I left way too quickly. I think I would have done it differently. I mean, I was on a ex-Christian forum on Reddit at the time, and they were like, don't do this. Don't exit in this way. Like you're doing this the wrong way. You're just going to feed into this, stereotype of yada, yada, yada. You should give them more grace. You sound like you're being really hardcore about this. And looking back at some of like the posts I had and whatnot, like I would agree with that in this mental frame now. But I think the amount of pain that was there in that moment of just like realizing I had to give all that up, you have to make that break. And it's going to be messy and you're probably going to mess up. There's going to be things that you look back and you're like, wow, that wasn't the most ethical of me. A different person now. And that's all a normal part of exiting these cult-like areas of evangelicalism. Yeah. And it's different than exiting evangelicalism itself. Because I've known friends that have exited evangelicalism. They wouldn't have had to use these tactics.
Right.
Versus with me coming home, being dramatic and laying the book down and saying this is all wrong. That was kind of the way I had to do it. Because if you would have done it quietly, I would have had to play this tiptoe game where they don't know that I'm not. I don't know whether I really am not. Right. And you just drag that out for years and you never really get to self-identify because you've never been given that opportunity. I mean, I've never been given the opportunity to make friends, date, do any of the normal things, right?
Yeah. Last thing we'll say about this, I quote Brian Peck quite often. He's a psychologist and he really pushed me on this. So back to the secular grace thing, he really pushed me on anger is a healthy response. And especially in a controlling or an abusive situation, your anger, your ability to push away and get out of that situation is valuable. And I never want to make it sound like I'm down on that. Right. Like I think you did the right thing. You got yourself out. Now you have a little more perspective maybe, but at the time you did what you had to do to be healthy.
Yeah. And that's where, like, I really like the work that you're doing because I believe it kind of brings light to the fact that when you're forming a value system after faith and after that period of anger that's going to come for some people and not for others, you want to do exactly what you're doing, which is open it up to, like, these areas where you can see the fringe stories that might bring light to, like, the caveats, the exceptions, the areas in which it doesn't need to go, because that better defines the concept itself, that brings to light what secular grace actually means and keeps it out of this gray area that you get in a lot of theology, which is you just leave the thing and you never talk about it and you never challenge it, because if you challenge it, then it crumbles.
No, I appreciate it. I love it every time somebody, forces me to be clearer. I think that's really, really important. So, Judah, I cannot tell you how awesome this conversation was. I think a number of people are going to really relate. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about doing this podcast is watching this happen as people go, man, that's my story. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, it's been great.
Final thoughts on the episode. This was a really fun and interesting conversation with Judah. Obviously, he's incredibly bright, and coming from a restrictive background that he says is at least cult adjacent, as well as the political conservatism, the anti-vaccination, anti-medicine, anti-government, and to come all that way to where Judah is today is astonishing. And how young he did that he was doing that in his teens is amazing. As I've said on a number of occasions, including in this conversation, I have a special place in my heart for particularly precocious kids who grow up in a fundamentalist environment and struggle with learning to trust their own intellect. And clearly, Judah is a success story of coming through that and now on track to get an MD. I think Judah's story of doubling and tripling down is so very common. Most of us leave kicking and screaming that it's not that we want to walk away from faith, but that we are forced to do so. And the attempt to work harder, to read the Bible more, to evangelize more, to rededicate to ministry, to read apologetics, to dig deeper, to find some foundation for the faith that we feel is crumbling. And ultimately, this is a futile effort. And yet, as Judah says, not just once or twice, but a few times, to double down is such a human experience that we cannot let go without making 100% sure we have tried everything. And of course, in Judah's case, he had tried everything. The scientific epistemology that we're talking about of how we know what we know has been deeply important to me, as it was for Judah. I'm acutely aware that the apologetics class may refer to this as scientism, but when I say that, I am not saying that the scientific method is the only way to know anything. However, I am saying it is the best way to know what we know, in that it stands up to scrutiny, it stands up to criticism. There may be areas where science can't answer something for us, but the things that science can answer for us, those answers can be trusted or not trusted. They can be validated, which is even better. For me personally, it was that I did not feel like I was allowed to question my faith, that was testing God in some way or another, and that it was lacking faith to ask questions. And this is what is so freeing on the other side in a scientific way of thinking, is those questions are not only encouraged, they are valuable. And as an object lesson, Judah provided that for me by questioning secular grace, pushing me to clarify, and I really thank him for doing so. It is very important to understand that secular grace is not a blanket forgiveness for crimes committed against us or crimes committed against society. It does not sweep atrocities or abuse under the rug. And in fact, as Judah and I talked about, anger can be an absolutely proper response to that kind of environment, and getting oneself out and into safety is of paramount import, and anger might help you to do that. I couldn't think of a better way to say it other than it is more about caring for people than forgiving atrocities. I acknowledge the dark side to Christian grace, then I'm not trying to make the same mistakes I think Christianity does. So thank you, Judah, for pushing me on that, for getting clarification. Thank you for telling us your story. and sharing with us what you've learned about medicine and the scientific method. I think we all have gained from this. Thank you so much. Judah is a member of our Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous. If you would like to join the group, you might get an opportunity to interact with him. Judah also blogs at jmedic.medium.com, and I will have links in the show notes. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about embracing our humanity and embracing our skills and the things that we are good at. I mentioned earlier my soft spot for precocious kids who grow up in a fundamentalist environment, but that goes well beyond just intellect. What are the things that you were held back from doing? For the women in my audience, I imagine you have a visceral response to that. Your leadership qualities, your teaching ability, your intellect, on many fronts you may have been held back. And what I'm encouraging you to do is to embrace those things about yourself and use them out in the world. For the LGBTQ community, being unable to express who you love and being unable to be honest about that within this framework, I'm encouraging you to embrace that and to love that about yourself. The point I want to make is there is a part of fundamentalist religion that takes away our humanity, and the thing that I am trying to communicate with secular grace and the secular humanism that I'm espousing here is not a denial of our humanity, but an embracing of that. Does that mean that we are perfect? Definitely not. But does it mean that we are unique and have unique things to give to the world, to participate in the world with? Absolutely. And the discovery of who you are and what you're good at is a lifelong process that is a joyous one, and it should be embraced rather than denied. We've got a number of really great episodes coming up. Matt Oxley is up next. Natalie, a Deconversion Anonymous episode, will be shortly thereafter. As I mentioned, I am trying to be a guest on various other podcasts. If you are interested in either having me on the podcast or coming and telling your story, get in touch with me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.